Ahoy there, interlocutors. I'm working on this Chevy truck dealing with some oil leaks. I'll put a time code here if you want to skip ahead to the part where I'm actually dealing with it, but I got a little story to kind of set up my troubles in trying to figure this out. So years ago, I used to work at an auto parts store, and I had a guy come in who was looking for a water pump for a small front-wheel drive car. I don't remember exactly what it was, a Cavalier, a Saturn, a Honda Accord, something like that. So I looked up his car and I went back on the parts shelf and grabbed his water pump and brought it out. He opened up the box and started examining it and got this real confused look on his face, like he didn't understand, something about this pump. And then he looked up at me and he said, "Where do you mount the fan to this water pump?" And I said, "Well, it's a transverse engine car. The fan's not mounted to the water pump. It's going to be probably an electric fan, attached to the radiator there." And he thought about that for a second, and then he said, "As soon as they started putting those engines sideways in cars, they just didn't make sense to me anymore." And I sympathize with him because I also prefer a longitudinally mounted engine. I just find they're easier to work on, but that's also the kind of cars I grew up with, right? So in trying to track down the oil leak on this truck, I kind of encountered a little bit of the same thing of like the way I think of things as being put together. So one thing that I had just never seen before, because I'd never owned an LS engine truck, is the way in which this rear main seal works on this truck. So if your experience comes mostly from small block Chevys, which is where mine comes from, I mean, not that huge amounts of experience, but that's where my experience was. The Suburbans I've owned up until this point, the Chevy trucks I've owned up until this point are small blocks. And in that configuration, the rear main seal and the crankshaft actually impinges into the oil pan, right? So the oil pan actually has a half circle in the back of the oil pan and it comes up there. On these LS engines, relative to the top of the oil pan, the crankshaft is much higher. It's all relative, right? But what that causes is it causes the rear main seal to be way up high, and rather than having this sort of two-piece seal design that you pound in and out or whatever, the rear main seal slides into it. But first, that rear main seal slides into this housing. And I'm going to get down there and I'm going to show you what the housing looks like. But this seems to be one of the most common oil leak points on this truck. So mine's at 210,000 miles. And by that point in time, rubber seals and stuff like that have started to heat cycle a bunch of times and they're worn out. So oil leaks become much more common at that era. I assumed that what I was dealing with was a rear main seal leak because it looked like it was coming from the rear main seal, or possibly an oil pan leak, but centered more around the rear of the oil pan. Everything I understand now after looking into this is that is not typically where these LS motors leak. They leak from a housing that's called a rear main cover, and it's a housing that bolts to the back of the engine, and then the rear main seal slips into that housing. So unfortunately, to fix this, you must pull the transmission. There is no way of getting around that. And then the other very common place that these trucks leak is the oil cooler, and specifically where the oil cooler mounts to the block. So if you have a 5.3, I believe the oil cooler is an optional thing. I don't know for sure. I'm pretty sure it's optional. I don't think it's standard. On the 6.0s, my understanding is the oil cooler is standard, because this is a 3/4 ton truck meant for more towing. They expect the engine to go through a little bit more abuse and the oil to get hotter, and they add an oil cooler into the system. And that oil cooler is a common leak point on these trucks. But in different ways, it could be different parts of the oil cooler that leak. And I'll show you what I mean when we get down under there and look at both of these two. My understanding is the two most common oil leak points on these trucks right here are the two things I'm about to show you. I'm sure they can leak from other places, but this is what seems to come up as these two. And there's a two-part component to the oil cooler leaking that I learned in two different places. Credit where it's due. I didn't come up with this stuff. I learned it from other videos. And then specifically that rear main cover, I heard people referencing it. I didn't really know what they mean. So I'll show you the rear main cover and I'll show you the new one that I bought so you have a part number, and hopefully you can determine if this is your problem. I have it.
This is one of those situations where the instructions say, pull straight back on the transmission and it'll come off. Well, it didn't. Nothing's ever that simple or straightforward. So I think the reason why this is so difficult is because this is a cast iron block. This is a 6-liter LS motor. This is a 4L80E aluminum transmission housing, cast iron block. I think there's a dissimilar metals issue going on here, and that's built up corrosion between here and here and bonded the bell housing to the back of the engine. So I went crazy looking all over the place to make sure I had every single fastener out of this transmission. And I'll show you where all the fasteners are so you can double check yourself. But I almost guarantee if you're really struggling to get this transmission pulled off this engine, it is not that you're missing a fastener. It's that these two have bonded together, rusted together, corroded together, something like that. And that's what's making it so difficult to get these two things to separate. So here's what I did. I already pulled the transfer case off. I didn't see any way of getting them off as a unit. It'd be really heavy and obviously more dangerous to get down. And with the with this truck being a torsion bar assembly, I also have a fairly large amount of cross members here in the back. So I needed clearance. So I pulled the transfer case off. I put 2 bolts through there with washers on both sides because I don't want to mar up these bolt holes right here. And then I connected a ratchet strap back to a piece of rear frame member, and I tensioned on the transmission towards the back of the vehicle. And while it was under tension, I went up there where the 2 dissimilar metals are, and I just heated this with a MAP gas torch. I just kept heating this, spraying penetrant on this, heating this, spraying penetrant on this, going back there and seeing if I could get another ratchet tightening on it. And eventually it did break loose. It's not broken loose on this side yet. I just wanted to stop and do the video real quick before but it will go the rest of the way, I'm sure. It's broken loose on the other side. I'll show you. So you can see it's broken loose on this side. There's the dowel right there. And you can see that that looks pretty rusty. So I think that's definitely part of the corrosion, but I also just think it's on the surface there and that these two are attached to each other, a sort of corrosion-y attachment between the two of them. So now it's broken loose on this side. I'm sure it'll come the rest of the way off. Again, I just wanted to stop. Once I get it down, I'll show you where the bolts go in it. Once you get this lower torque converter cover off, which is part of the connection of the transmission and the engine, there's not a whole lot of bolts remaining. They're tough to get to, but there's not a whole lot remaining. And if you're up there looking, you'll see them. You're probably not missing the bolts. If you're really struggling to get these off, it is probably that they are bonded together like this. One quick thing to add, while you're heating this side, if you are taking a MAP gas torch in here and heating this side, be aware that these 3 lines right here, these are your fuel lines. I don't know which one is which, but you've got pressure return and evap, evaporative gas line. So that's what these 3 are. So if you're heating this up, just be aware that, don't direct the heat directly up towards here. You know, if you want to shove a piece of sheet metal in there to act as a shield, or if you just can find a way to angle the torch down so that you're not shooting heat straight up at these fuel lines. These are fuel lines right here, and you are danger close to them if you're applying a MAP gas torch right here. So use your brain in this situation. And there it is, we're all the way separated. So here are the fasteners that hold this together. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I do not have a fastener here, even though there is a hole in the transmission for it. So on the transmission side, that's 1 alignment dowel, 2, 3, 4, 5, apologies, alignment dowel, and 6 down there. And you can see how rusty that is.
That even looks like a rust bond right there that I broke. So I'm sure that's why this was such a struggle to get this to separate, and it just didn't come smoothly. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna wire brush that all up, and then I'm just gonna apply a light coating of moly, light coating of grease to it. Just you know, wipe it on with my finger, not real thick, just to keep these two disparate metals from touching each other. I hope I never have to pull this transmission out of this truck again. I shouldn't, but you know how it goes. Do right by the next guy, cause half the time you are the next guy. Here we are under the truck, and this is the housing that I was talking about right here. It's held in with a series of 10mm fasteners, and then this is the rear main seal right here, as well as these two bolts right here that go up through the oil pan. And this housing seems to be the primary gasket that leaks. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if this rear main seal was also in need of replacement, but we're doing both at the same time, so I guess I won't know which one was actually bad, or if both were actually bad, or if only one of them. But yeah, this is the thing I'm replacing under here to deal with this oil leak, and you can see it's just kind of flinging all over in here. Everything is wet with oil. And then the other common leak point is this oil cooler right here. Now there's a gasket right in there, which if your transmission is in and your drive shaft is in, you have not great visibility of this piece. So it's nice to be able to look at it without the transmission and the drive shaft and everything in the way. But there's a gasket right there, and there are two different gaskets that come up when you do a parts listing search for this. And I'll show you a picture right now, mental note to myself or verbal note on video here. Show a picture of the gasket right now for the oil cooler. Now, this picture is a picture of the gasket if you have a block off plate. So you just have a plate here, but no lines coming out of it. If you do a search for this gasket, you'll get results for both, and you might go, which one is the one for me? If your oil cooler has lines to it and is acting as an oil cooler, then you need the first one. And if it's a block off plate, it's just covering up the holes in the engine so that oil doesn't leak out, then you need the second one. The other piece of this that leaks besides just that gasket is there's an O-ring behind here. I'll pull this out and I'll show you. So there it is, that little plug goes right in there. And this came out really easily. It could have possibly been just that it had loosened over time, which is interesting, but you can see right there is an O-ring. And man, that's hard as a rock on mine. Maybe mine was loose because that O-ring had hardened up and wasn't tightening anymore. Anyway, 9mm hex head, Allen head, whatever you want to call it, for that, and then a new O-ring. If there is a Chevy part number for this O-ring, I don't know what it is. It's an O-ring. Grab yourself a O-ring master kit, or take this down to the store of where your O-rings are and find the right one. I have a whole collection of O-rings. I'm not worried about it. I'll find one that fits. I got the oil cooler disconnected. It's just two 10mm fasteners that go through those two holes right there. And then this can pull away. And you can see what it looks like in there. And then there's the gasket right there. So I don't know the torque spec on these, but seeing as these are so prone to leaking, I'm actually going to see if I can find one and torque these two bolts down to spec, because I want to make sure I'm putting enough pressure on that, because I have actually tried to replace this once, and something's still leaking. I think it's mostly this, but since I'm in here, I'm going to do it a second time and do the O-ring here, which is, yeah, so dried up that it doesn't even feel like an O-ring anymore. If I hadn't been assured that this was actually an O-ring, I would be second guessing whether this is an O-ring, because it doesn't even feel like one anymore. It feels like hard plastic. But I am chipping chunks of it with my fingernail, so it must be a dried up O-ring. All right, let's get this rear cover off and see what that looks like underneath.
So there's what it looks like without the rear cover. This is obviously an oil passageway right here. Camshaft, crankshaft, and yeah, this whole thing probably, well, this whole thing definitely lives in oil. So there's oil flowing all through this. You know, typically, probably pumping up to the top of the motor, and then I'm not entirely sure how the oil galleries all work in this engine. But in any case, here's our gasket, and there's the back of our cover right there. You can see the rear main seal is still in it. So it's actually kind of nice in that way, because sometimes getting the rear main seal out can be difficult, but in this case, this cover comes off really easily once you pull the transmission, obviously, and then you can take this cover over to a workbench or whatever and gently remove this rear main seal and gently pound the new one in. Here's the gasket in question, and my understanding is that this is what's probably causing all my oil leakage. So this flexible, yeah, it's hard to, well, I don't know if I can really tell you how little force I'm applying by hand and how easily that's sort of snapping. It's definitely brittle. You know, it's requiring very little force to, yeah, it's brittle. So after 210,000 miles, I guess I can forgive it for being brittle. So yeah, I'll get that cleaned up, and we'll get a new rear main seal into this housing here. And then I bought an oil pan gasket, and I should probably do it while I'm here, but I'm trying to talk myself out of it because I don't wanna, so we'll see. You know, the worst part about filming yourself working, it's not all the extra time it takes to set up the camera and think about what you're gonna say, and maybe if you screw it up the first time, do a second take of it. It's that you end up in situations like I'm in, where you're underneath your truck, and you turn the music off because you want to record something, me talking to camera, explaining something, and then you don't want to bother crawling back out from underneath the truck. You've got something to do under here. You've got the tools you need, so you just sit underneath your truck and work in silence. And when you start to work in silence, you end up kind of just alone with your thoughts. There's nothing more dangerous than a mechanic alone with his thoughts, because his thoughts will naturally lead him to buying more stuff that he thinks he needs. More parts, more tools, more upgrades, more modifications. Yeah, that's the worst part about filming yourself work. Here we are with this cover plate out. There's the new seal right there. There's the old seal. That was relatively easy to pop out of there. There's actually 3 little spots to get a screwdriver under there, and then obviously flip it over and tap it from the back. So that was easy. This new seal has a plastic shape keeper, I guess you'd call that, in there. And this kit is FEL-PRO brand. That's BS40640. So that has the gasket and the rear main seal both in the same kit. So we're just gonna apply a little grease to the outside of this seal and then gently tap it into place until it's flush, and we'll get this installed. Well, I tried to convince myself that I didn't need to replace the oil pan gasket, but I wasn't very persuasive apparently. So this is the OE one, and I know that this is the OE one because it's riveted on. So there's a rivet right here that went through there, and there's a rivet right here, and you can actually see the head of it there is still in the gasket. So that was pretty easy. I just kind of ripped this off. That's why it's all bent up like this. I just kind of pried it up and off, and actually snapped the head off that rivet, which made removal of that one pretty easy. And then just took a little punch and punched them out from the back. So they're just there to hold this in place during assembly. They're not providing any more function than that. So out with the old, in with the new. There's that right there, new FEL-PRO gasket. And there it is, OS30693R is what I got. Fits this here pretty good. I am going to put a little dab of RTV back in those corners there where this gasket meets this plate here, because you've got a 90-degree bend right there. So that's definitely a possible leak point. So yeah, we'll put it together. As far as getting it out goes, my truck is 4-wheel drive, and I was able to do it just by dropping the front diff down, not removing it completely. So I'll show you. You can see there's the top link right there for the front differential, and you can see I just removed that bolt and let that hang down out of there. It's shifted a little, but that's because the steering's kind of pushed it over, so I can push it back, camera right there and up into place. And then down here on the bottom, this fastener right here, I just loosened that a little bit. Didn't remove it completely. Loosened that a little bit. That allowed this to pivot down. And then over on the passenger side, it's these two big bolts right here, front and rear, that held this up and into place. And then there's a lower cross member that spans between here and over here that needed removed. So it's a couple things to disassemble, but it's not too bad to let that front diff, and the front diff's hanging loose. If I had the strength, I could push that up, but anyway, I'll have to get a floor jack to push that back up into place. And the oil pan gasket, after doing that, wasn't too bad to get down and out. There's these wires in this loom right here are attached to the front of it via a 10mm bolt that's coming in from the driver's side there, going that way. And then there's a bracket, that bracket right there, that holds those cooler lines, transmission cooler lines, and that wiring loom right there. That bracket right there is also bolted. So you'll have to remove those two brackets. One is plastic, one is metal, that attach to the oil pan, and then remove the oil pan bolts, and she'll all come down. Also, should have a dab of RTV right there. You can actually see some orange factory RTV for the front timing chain cover. Here's a better look at that. There's the plastic bracket that holds those two separate wiring looms on. One clips into these little clips, the other one lays in here, and then these clips right here snap down over it to hold it in place. And the way that attaches to the front, took me a minute to figure this out, is that bolt right there on the side. You remove that, and then that pin right there slides out of a hole right here. So that's how you remove that. There's the bracket for the transmission cooler lines and the other two wiring looms. And then this, I believe, is your oil level sensor right here, and you have to disconnect that electrical connector right there, and then just remove the oil cooler itself and remove all the bolts that hold the pan on. Not a whole lot in the way, really. Not as bad as some things, but yeah, decent amount of removal to get it off. One of those rules that always comes back to bite you if you fail to follow it is don't tighten down any faster until you get all of your bolts in. So these two long ones right here that connect this rear cover to the oil pan, I struggled to get them in because I snugged these down before I did them. So just bear that in mind. These were tough. I had to loosen these off just a little bit to get these long bolts right here in. All the oil pan bolts, so all the way along here and all the way along here, are 18 foot-pounds, and all of these rear cover bolts are also 18 foot-pounds, and then these two rear cover to oil pan are 106 inch-pounds. So I'm gonna torque these all down, and I did take a double look at the manual, and it specified right here at this, it's a T-junction, so you've got block, pan, rear cover, all meeting in a T shape right here. And the manual did say a little RTV right there. So once you get started installing this thing, you gotta kind of keep going with it, because you're mating 3 different surfaces here, and you wanna put both the oil pan and the rear cover on at the same time if you've taken them both off at the same time. And then I just did a little grease there and slid the cover over the rear main seal, and that was really easy. That just pushed right there into place. It all went together really easily. Getting it all lined up was not a struggle at all. This was not a bad oil pan. Clearance with the front diff drop down there is plenty adequate to do the job. So this wasn't too bad, really. I mean, you have to take the transmission off to do it, but once it's out, the rest of it's not too terrible. I mean, if your truck's got a ton of rusty fasteners holding the that cross member in and holding your front differential in, then yeah, maybe that'll be a bit bigger of a deal. But overall, yeah, I'm looking forward to no more oil spraying out all under my truck and leaking all over my garage floor. One more thing worth mentioning here is there is a proper tightening sequence to all these oil pan fasteners. You can look it up, you know, it tells you 1, 2, 3, it goes back and forth. But generally speaking, the simple concept here with any kind of large flat pan like this, and this is true of intake manifolds, you know, heads, lots of other stuff, is you want to start from the center and then work your way out both directions. So start in the middle and work your way out. So start in the center over here, then go to the center over there, then come back over here and go towards the front, then go over there and go towards the front, then go over here and go towards the rear, and just alternate back and forth, distributing pressure that way and that way as you go. And that way you're not gonna squeeze the whole gasket towards the front or squeeze the whole gasket towards the rear. You'll apply even outward pressure slowly towards the front and slowly towards the rear, and that's the way you'll get the best seal and not have to ever do this again, hopefully. Here's the real test. I drove for about an hour yesterday, and I slipped this piece of cardboard underneath it. Not a drop, and that was right underneath the oil pan, right where it was pouring out before, so I solved it. Well, that's a wrap on this project. I'm real happy, no more leaks. I'll have a list in the description of all the gaskets that I had to replace as part of this, including the exhaust gaskets and the transfer case to transmission gasket, because I didn't expect those, so I was a little surprised by those. So hopefully that's everything. If you want to do pretty much the same thing on your truck, hopefully the list down below will include everything you need as far as gaskets go. The stuff you have to take apart to get access, and the gaskets you're actually replacing because they are the source of the leak. So you got any questions or suggestions or anything that I missed, or yeah, anything like that, put it down in the comments below. Let's chat. I'll talk to you later, interlocutors.